Reeling in a fish can be very exciting and sometimes a little nerve-wracking, especially if it's a big one. So in this video, we're going to look at all the different ways that you can put the odds in your favour to lose less fish and get more of them into your net. The most obvious thing to talk about here is barbed hooks versus barbless. Now, of course, this is quite controversial, you could say, and different people will have different opinions. However, there's one thing that probably everyone will agree on, and that is that a hook with a barb or micro barb on it will stay in a fish's mouth better, even if your line was to fall slack. Now, of course, these days we just have to use whatever the fishery that we're fishing allows us to use. Almost all the time there are barbless hook rules on many venues, and you've got to use whatever you're allowed to. Now, one thing I'll say is that if you are using a barbless hook, it's absolutely imperative that during the battle with the fish, you don't let the line fall slack at any point. A barbless hook will just fall out of a fish's mouth very, very easily as soon as the tension is removed from the line. So that's worth keeping in mind. However, there are a few things that you can actually do before you even get a bite to stack the odds in your favour and give yourself more chance of landing the fish. One of those things is thinking about line strength and hook size. Now, in my opinion, the stronger the line you're using and the bigger the hook you're using, the more chance you have of landing the fish. However, in many cases, overly strong line and big hooks can reduce your chances of getting a bite in the first place. So it's all about finding a balance between getting the bite and actually landing it. Now, there's no point fishing with tiny hooks, thin line, and losing every fish that you hook. But there's also no point fishing with tow rope as line and a giant hook and never actually getting a bite. So one thing I'd probably recommend with this is that if you're fishing somewhere weedy, somewhere full of snags and big fish, tackle up strong, 20-pound line, size 6 or size 4 hooks, and give yourself the best chance of getting those fish in your net. However, if you're on somewhere without really any obstacles, maybe the fish aren't particularly big, there's no reason to tackle up so strong. You could get away with finer lines and smaller hooks, maybe size 8s, even 10s, and you'll be able to land the fish because you won't have to apply so much pressure as you're trying to bring them in. Another thing you can do before you actually get the bite is consider how you set your drag whilst it's on the rest or potentially whilst you're holding the rod when you're stalking. What I mean by that is many people will put the rod on the rest and slacken the drag right off so it's really loose. That means that you get screaming bites when the fish picks up the bait and it zooms off across the lake. Now, that's fine if there's no weed or obstacles that the fish could get into. However, if you're faced with lily pads, weeds, branches in the water, you're actually best off securing the rod, maybe with a peg, or making sure that the eye of the rod is positioned behind the bite alarm and actually having your drag pretty tight. This means that when a fish takes the bait, it doesn't have a chance to pull a load of line and reach the safety of those snags. It gives you more chance of picking up that rod and stopping the fish before it could potentially snag you up. Of course, different people have different opinions on what rigs are best to land fish on. Some people say, oh, every time I use a trod rig, I seem to lose loads of fish. Other people say, whenever I'm using a long rig, I lose fish. Everyone just seems to have a different opinion on this. And I'd say one thing that's worth observing is each time you land a fish, look at how it's hooked. Was it hooked just on the edge of the mouth? Maybe you need to make your rig a bit longer. Was it hooked really deep down? Maybe you could get away with a shorter rig and actually hook more fish. But like I say, actual rigs, which ones are best, which ones you lose more fish on, it's debatable and everyone will have a different opinion. Now let's take a look at what to do when your rod finally tears off and you've got a fish on the end. When you get a bite, you'll want to pick up the rod as quickly as possible. As you pick up the rod, with the other hand, you might want to tighten up the drag if it's been set slightly loose to allow a fish to take line on the bite. The drag for most carp fishing reels is on the front. and it will tighten in one direction and loosen in the other. It's worth having a little play with this drag functionality before you actually are fishing, as getting your head around which way tightens and which way loosens is quite key. The last thing you want to do is accidentally tighten too much, or pick up the rod and accidentally slacken it off completely, because that can end up with a bird's nest of line and potentially a lost fish. So my advice would be, get used to the drag on your reel, have a good play with it before you actually get a bite and before you start fishing, because that will put you in a good position, ready for when that bite comes along. Now that you've picked the rod up and you're playing the fish, the aim is to keep the rod solidly bent round at pretty much all times. If you were to allow the rod to go straight and the line to fall slack, that's giving a fish a really good chance to come off and escape. That is normally the reason why people lose fish, is because they fail to keep the line tight at all times. Now, you don't want to reel like a madman and just try and crank the fish in straight away. The aim is to reel when the fish is coming towards you, but as the fish is sort of running away from you powerfully, just allow it to take line from your clutch. The way I've found worked really well whilst playing a fish is to, as it comes towards you, reel down towards it, and then bring the rod up above your head and put a nice bend in it. Then you can reel down again, aiming to keep a bend in the rod at pretty much all times. And as you reel down a little bit more, you can then stop and bring the rod back towards you in a sort of pumping motion. You want to make that motion as smooth as possible. Any jolty, jagged movements are giving the fish a chance to fall off. But that's the gist of playing a fish. Of course, in time, you will pick this up and be more proficient at it. When you first play a fish, yeah, of course you might lose one and your rod might be all over the place and you might get in a tangle on your reel, but these things happen. You'll get used to it in time. Playing fish is a bit of an art. It's just like casting. The worst time is the first time, and then after that you gradually improve. If a fish suddenly wakes up and starts charging away, like you've got a really big one, you may have to loosen the drag slightly to allow it to take some line. Normally, you can't really just stop a big fish in its tracks. If you were to tighten up your drag absolutely solid and a fish was to charge away from you, it probably would just pull your rod towards it until it maybe broke your line or the hook pulled from its mouth. So as a fish charges away, just loosen the drag off a little bit, let it run, and then when it slows down and you feel it sort of tiring out, you can tighten that drag and start pumping that fish back towards you with the motion I described before. Now, there's one time where you probably won't use that pumping motion, and that's where you're fishing directly across to weed or dangerous snags like roots or something in the water. If a fish is getting towards a danger zone and you really have to stop it, rather than sort of pumping it like this, your best bet is to tighten the drag up quite a lot and slowly walk backwards. You walk backwards and backwards and backwards until you're right at the back of your swim, and then reel down and then start doing it again. The reason that this seems to work is because it applies really solid and constant pressure to a hooked fish, and it doesn't give it a chance to sort of turn and swim away from you. When you're sort of reeling, as I was describing before, each time in between reeling and pumping, the fish kind of has a little moment where it could turn its head and bury its head into some weeds or something. But the walking back motion is a real good edge if you're in a little bit of danger and you need that fish to come towards you. As the fish is coming towards you, you might notice it kiting, swimming across to the left or to the right of where you're stood. In this circumstance, let's say it's heading down to the left, you will want to bring your rod round to the right and apply what's known as side strain. Side strain is where you counterbalance the fish's movement. If it's charging left, you bring the rod to the right to try and steer it back towards you. If it's heading down towards some lily pads on the right hand side of your swim, you'll want to bring the rod over to the left. By having the rod sort of lower and to the side, you're more likely to be able to turn that fish and bring it back towards you and steer it away from danger. Once that fish is actually right underneath your rod tip, you might be like, the battle's over, I've got it. But actually this is the time where you'll want to slacken off your drag a little bit. Reason being is when you're out in the middle of the lake, you've got quite a lot of stretch in your line. If a fish suddenly charges off, the line can stretch, it absorbs the lunges of the fish. However, right underneath the rod tip, you don't have that stretch in a load of line. And a fish can, when you sort of reach out to try and net it, it can suddenly zoom off. And that's where you want to have your drag a little bit looser towards the end of the fight, just in case it suddenly does one mad rush or charges off at the last minute. Now, some people prefer to play fish on the backwind. I'll press that button now, and what that enables you to do is reel backwards when the fish is swimming away from you and reel forwards when it's coming towards you. This is a method that maybe people who fished for longer might use more often. If I was, just starting out, I'd almost always recommend you play the fish off of the drag. It's just a bit more reliable, there's less room for error. But the times when I've used the backwind is when I've been fishing with a reel with a dodgy clutch. If it's like zzz, 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 locking up and it's a horrible, cheap, rubbish reel, then you might prefer to flick that switch over and be in complete control by backwinding as the fish runs, or allowing it to take line like that. But it's really up to you. It's personal preference, really. So the fish is in front of you, you can tell it's sort of mostly tired out now. The best way to land a fish, particularly a big fish, is to put the net beneath the surface and draw the fish over the top of the net before then lifting it. Sometimes it can be tempting to charge after the fish and poke at it with the landing net and try and scoop it as quickly as possible. However, this can and has for me over the years resulted in a few lost fish. Getting too excited and just going crazy with the net, trying to scoop it up. Yeah, the best way is definitely to lower the net beneath the surface, ease the fish slowly over the top of it, and then lift the net up around it. If all has gone well, the fish is in your landing net. You've done a good job. However, there are circumstances where a fish might get snagged up. It might end up stuck in some weeds. Well, what do you do? Well, the last thing you want to do is pull really hard and potentially snap your line. That's a no-go. You don't want that to happen. Many times, I've hooked a fish and it's ended up stuck in weeds or tangled around branches, and I've thought, it's game over. I've lost this fish, surely. And in fact, what I've done is I've put the rod on the ground, loosened off the clutch or the drag on the reel until it's really, really loose, and I've given that fish 15 or 20 minutes to basically free itself. Now, you'd be surprised at the number of times some slack line and a little bit of time, that rhymed, but yeah, some slack line and to wait a little bit, the fish just unsnags itself. It swims out of the weed bed, it comes free. What you'll notice is you'll put the rod on the ground, you'll have to sit there, make a cup of tea and be patient, and then you just start to notice the line just peeling from the spool. Or if you've left the bail arm open, you'll just start to see some line paying off. That's when you go, right, okay, it's got on the move again. Grab the rod, apply as much pressure as you can, and get it out. And that has worked for me many, many times. In a worst case scenario, you might have to go out in a boat to unsnag the carp. Of course, you want to be really careful when you're doing that. Don't forget your life jacket. Potentially you could wade out if the lake is shallow enough. If you've got waders on you and you know for a fact that the lake isn't too deep, you might be able to wade out and unsnag the carp like that. But one thing I would say is definitely prioritize your own safety and well-being over the carp. You want to land the fish, of course, but if you're a really bad swimmer, don't go charging out into a lake to try and free it. No fish, no matter how big it is worth risking your life for. I really hope this video will help you land more fish in the future. Of course, once you've got that fish in the net, you'll then want to take good care of it on the bank, weigh it and unhook it safely. And to learn more about that, check out the video that is on the screen right now. And I'll see you again on fishing tutorials soon.